Hello everyone and welcome to 2021's first SRP AURPO webinar. Welcome to today's topic, which is all about an introduction to NORM. In terms of number of attendees, we've got again a packed full virtual audience of 240 attendees today, which is great to see. These webinar programs continue to be really well attended and a real success. For those of you who are familiar, apologies, but I just want to go over a couple of the ground rules of how we normally run these sessions. So in terms of the ground rules, there are 4 key things to follow. Firstly, questions you can ask at any point through the Q&A box. So you should see on your screen a little Q&A box, looks like a kind of question mark inside a speech bubble. So feel free to click on that and ask questions as we go along. We will then be directing them directly to Trevor at the very end of the talk. So just to let them complete the presentation first. The most liked questions will be the ones which will be preferentiated to be answered. We tend to find that in these talks, we get more questions than we can possibly answer during the duration of the talk. So those which get the most likes will be the ones we'll be putting to Trevor today. And then ultimately, all the other questions we'll answer and post on our events page. So you can make sure you get your answers at some point. In terms of registering your attendance and being able to claim CPD, please email Charlene. You'll see her email address on the screen now, and just use that email code ITNORM #, and that will be used to give you an email confirmation of the CPD points you've claimed today. And really, what's really quite important is after the end of today's talk, if you can send us any of your feedback. There's an online survey link which will be sent after the webinar. Now, this is really important because it helps us ultimately improve the webinar program and find new topics to take this going forward. And speaking of new topics, there are 2 other webinars to be aware of which are coming in the not too distant future. We've got an introduction to IRMA on the 4th of February, which will be delivered by Jim Thurston, and we've got an introduction to proton beam therapy facility design on the 12th of February. And don't worry, we've got a lot of other topics coming up as well. We've got a jam-packed program and a dedicated webinar working group that now sits in SRP, which is run in partnership with AURPO, to make sure we can keep this going and keep this going for free as well, as this is really important to reach as many people as possible. And to introduce our speaker, I would just like to hand over to that needs no introduction, Professor Pete Cole, who is an SRP past president and current president of AURPO. Over to you, Pete.
Thank you, Pete. Hello and welcome to every one of you attendees from the UK and also from around the world. It gives me great pleasure to say that AURPO and SRP continue to collaborate to bring you this ongoing series of free webinars, which are designed to support the training needs of our members in these difficult times, but also the wider radiation protection community and promote knowledge exchange throughout the world. To this end, we have established, as Pete just said, a webinar working group to facilitate the process moving forward by planning topics to be delivered by outstanding speakers in a programme for 2021. And so today's speaker is Dr. Trevor Jones from Advanced Psi Limited. Trevor has 18 years consulting experience in the management of environmental radioactivity and radioactive wastes. He's been responsible for the development of a facility to descale NORM from contaminated oil and gas equipment and for permitting waste at several landfill sites. From 2011 to 2013, Trevor was a member of the Scottish Government Project Board for developing the UK NORM waste strategy. In addition, he is my colleague on the webinar working group. And so without any further ado, I'll hand over to you, Trevor.
That's great. Thanks very much, Peter. I'll just see if the technology works and if I can share my desktop. Okay, thank you very much. What I'm going to do today is give a very high-level overview of the topic of NORM, running through some of the issues, some of the history and regulation, and then a very quick overview of some of the norm industries. Because of the time available, I'm concentrating on radioactive substances regulation. I'm not discussing things like radiation protection issues or transportation and so on, and I'm only covering solid wastes, so I'm not discussing liquids at all. Very importantly, that there isn't enough time for me to cover radon in any detail. That's really a significant topic and would make another good webinar. But I'm also going to talk mainly about the regulations in the UK, although I will talk about sort of the international basis for those regulations. So obviously everything is to some extent naturally radioactive. There are different types of naturally occurring radionuclides. We have the primordial radionuclides, which were formed very long before the Earth, so that we only have those with very long half-lives remaining, the others having decayed to extinction. And then we have the secondary radionuclides of the thorium and uranium decay chains, which are the most important in terms of norm. And finally, we have cosmogenic radionuclides, which are formed by the action of cosmic rays in the atmosphere. So when we talk about norm, what we are generally talking about is situations where naturally occurring materials are extracted, processed or used, or land is developed, and it increases the potential for human exposure to natural radionuclides or their release into the environment. And generally when people talk about it, we talk about the most significant ones, which are the natural thorium and uranium decay chains, with or sometimes without potassium-40. Although the term norm would actually refer to all primordial radionuclides. We don't generally refer to cosmogenic radionuclides as norm. In the States in particular, there's a term that's been started to be used called T-norm, or technologically enhanced norm, and that's to differentiate between natural background exposures and those where human activities have resulted in inadvertent concentration of norm radionuclides. But that's outside the USA. The term T-norm is not widely used, and generally the terms norm and T-norm are used synonymously. So if you look at all of the primordial radionuclides and look at their abundance in the continental crust, and then plot that against the specific activity of the natural elements, you can see that the most significant ones are the ones that are circled there. So potassium, rubidium, thorium, uranium, and samarium. And if you look at their actual contribution to natural radioactivity in the continental crust, which is the crust that makes up the continents on which we live, as opposed to the oceanic crust, you can see that the activity is dominated by potassium, and that rubidium, thorium, and uranium are the other most significant contributors. So the way these behave affects their actual chemistry, affects their distribution in the environment. So potassium and rubidium are group 1 metals, which means they're highly reactive. So they don't occur in nature as the native elements. They always occur in minerals as compounds with other elements. And they are what's called large ion lithophiles, which means they have a high ionic radius. And that means that they're not compatible with ferromagnesian minerals, or what are called mafic minerals, which are the minerals which make up the majority of the oceanic crust. So as those mafic minerals crystallize out of the cooling, the magma within the Earth's crust, the potassium and rubidium become concentrated in what's left, which is the lighter elements which make up the continental crust, and particularly the more what's called acidic rocks, things like granites, for example. So potassium in particular, it's the 6th most abundant element in the crust, and it forms a whole range of major rock forming minerals, particularly things like potassium feldspars and micas and so on. So it is ubiquitous. When those minerals weather, that potassium is readily mobilized and it can become redeposited as evaporites, as salts, what we call potash. And those evaporite deposits can be very thick. For example, there are evaporite deposits several kilometers thick beneath the North Sea. And then uranium and thorium, well, these are what's called high field strength elements. So they have a high ionic charge, which, like potassium and rubidium, makes them incompatible with mafic minerals. So they are also concentrated in the acidic igneous rocks, and particularly the ones that crystallize at a later stage. So things like granites and particularly pegmatites, which is why they're often associated with mineralization. They're the late stage hydrothermal fluids which mineralize other rocks. So when those rocks weather, the uranium and thorium can become accommodated in the lattice of clay minerals because of their charge. The clay mineral lattice expands, and so you get high uranium and thorium contents in mud rocks like shale and their metamorphosed equivalents, which are slates, or they become dissolved in the groundwater and redeposited in porous rocks like sandstones and conglomerates. So that can be quite significant. They do form some significant uranium ore bodies, for example, or in sedimentary rocks. Uranium and thorium, of course, are at the head of natural decay chains. And as the elements decay, as the decay chain progresses and you get different elements formed, those elements have different chemistries. And so they're subject to different geochemical processes, things like mobilization, transport and redeposition. And that's very significant in terms of determining where these minerals occur. So, for example, I'll talk later particularly about the oil and gas industry, where this is a well-known fact, but things like radium enter solution and are transported, and radon gas, of course, is emanated in the gas phase. So in terms of the contribution to average background radiation, 71% of the average annual dose in the UK is due to the presence of norm, of which 2/3 is due to the inhalation of radon. So radon is by far, in terms of dose, the most significant norm issue. But as I said, it's not something that there is the time to go into in detail in this particular talk. If you look at the ingestion dose, which is about 11% of the overall background dose that we receive, 2/3 of that ingestion dose is due to the presence of potassium-40 in the foods that we eat. So in terms of history of norm, well, of course, industrial activities involving norm have been going on since, well, at least the Bronze Age, and we're talking about things like mining and smelting, the use of pigments, ceramics, glassware and so on, where of course radioactivity was incidental. That wasn't the purpose, but those activities were widespread, and in some cases, particularly things like mining, have produced significant volumes of wastes. And in fact, the effects of radon exposure were actually recognised and recorded as early as the 1500s in Central Europe. At the time, of course, it wasn't known what the cause was, but what was called Schneeberger lung disease was actually recognised as lung cancer in 1879. The cause was then not established, but of course, that came later. So in terms of the industrial use of norm, well, obviously radioactivity was discovered at the very end of the 19th century. The discovery, 1896, of what we now know as gamma radiation given off by uranium salts by Becquerel, and then of course the Curies extracted radium from pitchblende, actually from one of the mines where the radon issue had been identified as early as 1898. So from then on, in the early part of the 20th century, these exciting new properties were exploited in a range of industries. So primarily it was luminizing, but there were a wide range of other applications, things which I'm sure people are very aware of, things like quack medicines, medical devices, a whole range of consumer products, even foods, toys, as well as industrial devices. And those activities utilizing radium were historically widespread, including in some cases literally cottage industries. Things like luminizing was done as a cottage industry. It was outsourced to individuals working in their own homes. So in terms of the recognition of health effects, well, the first papers on radiation damage came more or less at the same time as the discovery of radiation and radioactivity. But the risks to radium workers were either not recognized or deliberately ignored, to the extent that it was invariably women doing the work. Luminizing activities, they were encouraged to use their lips or tongues to point the brushes they used to apply the radium luminized paint. And many developed radiation sickness, things like anemia, bones fractures and jaw necrosis, and had an extremely high incidence of cancer. And in fact, that was recognized starting in 1928 and then going on through the 1930s. There were a number of court cases, particularly in the States, and these cases became known as the Radium Girls. In terms of radon exposure, it was first associated with uranium mining. So although high radon concentrations were first demonstrated in what were then silver mines in 1901, the connection to lung cancer in miners was not really suggested even until the 1920s, and it was much later than that, probably in the 1940s or 50s, that that started to be recognized as a problem. So in terms of regulation, by the 1920s, radiation protection regulations had started to be established in a number of countries. And in fact, because of international interest, what was initially called the International X-ray and Radiation Protection Committee, which later became our ICRP, was established in 1928. And the initial focus of regulation was on those activities involving the deliberate use of material for its radioactive properties in what we now call practices involving radioactivity. So in terms of norm, that was initially radium production and use, and subsequently, of course, uranium mining and processing of the ore, which initially was in the 1940s as part of the development of nuclear weapons, and subsequently expanded enormously with the advent of nuclear power. Interestingly, although there was a lot of research was done on radon effects, particularly in uranium miners, and the first suggestions of radon being a hazard inside dwellings, there was some work in Scandinavia in the 1950s. It wasn't really until the 1970s that started to be thought of as a hazard. And in fact, the first recommended controls on radon levels in homes were not the recommendations were not made until the 1980s. So in terms of regulation in the UK, there were initial regulations focused on the use of radium for luminizing activities in the 1940s, Radioactive Substances Act in 1948. But that was very basic in terms of its controls on the supply and use of radioactive substances, and those were fairly broadly defined. So it wasn't until the introduction of the Radioactive Substances Act in 1960, which actually didn't come into force until 1963, that the focus changed from regulating the use of radioactive substances to regulating the activity and the premises where those substances were used. So that was really the first comprehensive radioactive substances regulation in the UK. And of course, when they were drawing up the regulations, they recognised that there was a challenge. Because everything is to some extent radioactive, they wanted to avoid capturing everyday materials that were radioactive but weren't presenting a hazard within the scope of regulations. So what they did was, for naturally occurring radionuclides, they defined in the regulations lower limits of activity for those radioactive elements, below which the materials that were being used or the activities that were using them were not captured by the regulations. So at the time, those limits were defined by elements rather than isotopes, and they were based on an analysis of substances routinely used by industry. So they looked around at the activities that were being undertaken, and they set the levels at such that they would not capture the vast majority of those industries that were utilising and producing, inadvertently utilising naturally occurring radioactive materials. It was at first proposed to include potassium in that list, but when the bill was progressing through Parliament, it was actually thought that that would capture a whole range of materials, and so potassium was actually removed from the scope of regulation under RSA 60 at a late stage before it was brought into force. But even after it was brought into force, there were a whole range of industries and activities which they found were being captured, and so a series of round about 19 separate exemption orders were implemented over the years to exempt additional substances and practices. So things like phosphatic substances and rare earths, natural gas, lead, substances of low activity, geological specimens. They were all subject to their own exemption orders, and the activity limits and the exemption limits that were set in those were not at all risk-based or consistent, and of course they were based on elements rather than activities. So interestingly, at that stage there were no activity thresholds applied to artificially created radioactive substances. So right from the dawn of the earliest regulations, there have been double standards for the regulation of exposure due to norm, or radioactive substances due to norm and anthropogenic radionuclides. So by the 1990s, there was widespread international recognition that whilst most norm doesn't result in a significant radiation dose, there were some work activities taking place that should really be regulated. And there were what were called basic safety standards produced by both the IAEA and the European Community, as it was in those days, for protection against ionizing radiation. Ionizing radiation. Now these are not regulations. They don't have the force of law in themselves. They only have the force of law if they are implemented by individual nations. The difference being that the European basic safety standards, the implementation by member states is actually mandatory, although they do not have to be implemented directly. So the way in which they're implemented differs from member state to member state. But the approach that both of these took to the regulation of norm was consistent. Where norm radionuclides were deliberately used for their radioactive fissile or fertile properties, so they're being deliberately used as radioactive materials or exploited for their radioactive properties, they were captured by the regulations. And it was then left to identify, to regulatory authorities, to identify additional specific practices involving NORM that required regulatory control. In all other situations where there was exposure to natural levels of radiation due to unmodified concentrations of radionuclides in most materials, they were excluded from the scope of regulation. Where there was chronic exposure to NORM resulting from radioactive residues from past practices, it was recognised that those should be subject, where necessary, to intervention to reduce those. But that's a separate approach, the intervention approach, as opposed to the regulation of practices. Importantly, these safety standards also introduce the concept of clearance and exemption of materials used in practices from regulatory control. Clearance being if you have a material which is used deliberately for its activity, but for example, the wastes or byproducts are not sufficiently radioactive that they warrant control, then they can be cleared from the requirement from subsequent regulatory control. They can be released from regulation. Exemption is where the activity concentration or total quantity of materials used is so low that regulatory control is not warranted. So both the IAEA and EC basic safety standards included or referenced clearance and exemption values for different radionuclides. Broadly, they were based on the same standard, which is an effective public dose of less than 10 microsieverts a year. But the way that they were calculated differed, and the actual values for some radionuclides differed between the two. Now, both sets of basic safety standards have been updated. The EU Basic Safety Standards Directive was updated in 2013 and the IAE Basic Safety Standards in 2014. They reflected the change in management approach. We now talk about, instead of practices, we now talk about planned exposure situations, existing exposure situations, and emergency exposure situations. And they introduced what's called a graded approach to regulation, whereby there are different degrees of regulation depending on the risk of the activity that's being undertaken. But in terms of NORM, they maintained the previous approach in that most exposures to NORM were managed as existing exposure situations, and that those activities requiring regulation were broadly unchanged. So that's deliberate use of materials for their radioactive fissile or fertile properties, or additional practices that are specified by the regulator as requiring regulatory control. In both cases, they also brought the use of NORM in consumer products within the scope of regulation, whether that's deliberately introduced or not. Both the European and IAEA basic safety standards now reference the same set of clearance and exemption values, which are all in a document, an IAEA document called RSG 1.7. And there are separate values listed for anthropogenic radionuclides and NORM radionuclides. But again, they are based on this public dose, effective public dose of less than 10 microsieverts a year. The European Basic Safety Standards Directive actually goes beyond the IAEA Basic Safety Standards in that it fully integrates the protection from natural radiation sources into the same regulatory system as the system for protection of exposure from man-made radionuclides. It also, for the first time, extended European regulations to include indoor radon exposure. That was included in the original IAEA safety standards, but not in the European safety standards. And it also extends the regulation to the exposure from NORM in building materials within Europe for the first time. And Whereas the previous regulations simply left it more or less to the individual regulators to identify industries or activities at which they norm may require to be regulated, there is an explicit list within the European Basic Safety Standards of industries which the regulators must take into account. So you can see that that includes a fairly wide range of industries, including things like oil and gas production, phosphoric acid production, primary iron production, as well as mining of ores other than uranium. So in the UK, our regulations implement the EU Basic Safety Standards Directive. But in terms of radioactive substances regulation, because the management of radioactive substances and wastes was devolved when in the late 1990s, when power was devolved to the Scottish government and the Welsh governments, and later to the Northern Ireland Assembly, we now have different regulatory regimes for radioactive substances in different parts of the UK. So whereas we had the Radioactive Substances Act, which originally applied across the whole of the UK, that now only applies in Northern Ireland, and until primary legislation is amended, it still applies offshore in UK waters. In England and Wales, we have the environmental permitting regulations, where radioactive substances was brought under the same regulatory permitting regime as non-radioactive substances in 2010. And in Scotland, we now have the Environmental Authorisation Scotland regulations, where radioactive substances was the first regime to transfer into an integrated authorisation framework at the end of 2018. So whilst the radioactive substances requirements in England, Wales and Northern Ireland remain broadly similar, the regulatory regime in Scotland is now quite significantly different from that in the rest of the UK. Now, we've always had a system of exemptions, but I mentioned before some of the issues associated with that system of exemptions. That regime was comprehensively revised in 2011 to make it based on risk-based numerical radioactivity limits. But the terminology that we use in the UK is a bit different to that used in the basic safety standards. Whereas the basic safety standards talk about exemption, meaning exemption from regulatory control, we call that out of scope, because we still use the term exemption to mean exempt from permitting. So materials which have an activity concentration above the out of scope level, but less than the exemption level, are still regarded legally as radioactive, but they are exempt from the requirements to hold a permit for the keeping, treatment and use and disposal of that material. The exemption values for anthropogenic radionuclides and norm, the differentiation between them is maintained through the current regime. So for both anthropogenic and norm radionuclides that are deliberately used for their radioactive properties, the out of scope values are based on a radiation dose to the public of less than 10 microsieverts a year, approximately, because the values are actually rounded. But for norm radionuclides that are used in a specified norm industrial activity, the out of scope values are based on a dose of 300 microsieverts a year. So we've maintained these double standards for anthropogenics or deliberate use of norm radionuclides and for norm that's used in industry, where it's not deliberately used or processed for its radioactivity. Any norm radionuclides that are not used in a norm industrial activity are out of scope of regulation regardless of their activity. So that's a key point. If it's not used for its radioactivity and it's not in one of the specified norm industrial activities, it's out of scope of regulation. So I've listed on the right there, I've actually paraphrased them here, but these are the norm industrial activities which have been identified in the UK. They differ somewhat from the list that's actually in the European Basic Safety Standards. So, for example, the production of oil and gas is within scope of regulations, but the storage, distribution and use of natural gas in the UK is actually outside the scope of regulation. Other things like China clay extraction, which is a key issue, and coal mine dewatering in the UK are within the scope of regulation, whereas they're not on the list that's in the European Basic Safety Standards. But because they were identified as presenting a potentially significant risk, they are within scope of regulation in the UK. Importantly, the only natural radionuclides which are regulated in the UK, unless they're used deliberately for their radioactive properties, are radionuclides in the natural uranium and thorium decay chains. In the UK, other norm radionuclides, including potassium-40 and rubidium-87, have been deliberately omitted. So they are always out of scope of regulation, regardless of the activity that may be present. And those out of scope values, which are based now, since the revision in 2018, based on the IAEA clearance and exemption values, those out of scope values apply consistently across the UK, but the exemptions regime no longer applies in Scotland. Scotland now has implemented the graded approach to regulation directly, whereas that's been fudged in England and Wales to make sure that we've implemented the regulations, or implemented the European Union Basic Safety Standards, but kept the old, if you like, it's been shoehorned into the old regulatory regime structure, whereas Scotland has started from scratch and developed a new regime which directly implements this graded approach to regulation. So in terms of exemption, in all parts of the UK except Scotland, there are two levels of exemption for norm wastes arising from norm industrial activities or the remediation of historic radium contaminated land. We have a lower activity where there are limits on the activity and the total quantity that can be disposed of per year, either to landfill or to incinerator. If you are within those limits, you can dispose of that waste to any licensed, conventional waste licensed landfill or incinerator without any requirement for that license or incinerator or you to hold a radioactive substance activity permit. And then there is a higher level, what's called type 2 norm waste, if the activity concentration wants to be exceeded up to the higher activity limits that are listed in the table there, or you want to dispose of a higher quantity of waste, you can dispose of those to any landfill without the requirement for a permit, subject to a site-specific risk assessment being conducted. Importantly, with exemptions, any markings indicating that waste to be radioactive have to be removed, and there's no requirement to notify the regulator or the disposal site operator that you are disposing of that waste. In Scotland, as I mentioned before, they have a separate regulatory regime. There isn't now an equivalent type 2 norm waste in Scotland. Anybody who generates or disposes of waste which would fall within that type 2 norm waste limit in Scotland must now notify SEPA and obtain a permit if necessary. So just a brief look at some of these NORM industrial activities. By far the largest producer of NORM wastes in the UK is the oil and gas industry. So obviously this is something which there has been oil and gas production since the 1800s, but it's really ramped up since the 1960s and 70s. And about 99% of the total is produced offshore in the UK. We do actually have the largest onshore oil field in Europe, on the south coast at Wytch Farm in Dorset. And the extraction of oil and gas obviously mobilises NORM from the source and reservoir rocks. So you can see there some of the estimated annual quantities. I would say they are probably underestimates, almost certainly underestimates. As I mentioned before, the actual mobility of the radionuclides in the uranium and thorium decay chains, which are the ones that dominate in terms of the oil and gas industry, varies. So the radium decay products are slightly soluble, so they move with the pore water, when that pore water is brought to the surface, the radium either stays in solution or it can co-precipitate with other minerals, forming a scale. Whereas radon migrates mainly with the gas stream, and you mainly get the decay products from radon decay, so particularly lead-210 and polonium-210, deposited as scale or sludges. So that's simply some pictures where you've got NORM scale deposited inside tubulars and on other components, which is an issue in terms of the radiation dose, and also has to be removed before those materials can be reused or recycled. We have the manufacture of titanium dioxide, which is an important industry in the UK. Titanium dioxide is a pigment used in a wide range of paints and plastics and so on. Basically anything that's a bright white colour has probably got titanium dioxide in it. There are two main UK producers, one in Hartlepool, one in Immingham, and the radionuclides of concern there are particularly from the uranium and thorium decay chains. So there's something like 200,000 tonnes of solid wastes produced per year from the dioxide manufacture in the UK. The majority of that is disposed of to landfills. Iron and steel, again, historically very important. There are now only 2 steelworks remaining, but iron and steel production uses a significant quantity of raw materials containing NORM, particularly iron ore. And here you get the volatile radionuclides, particularly lead-210 and polonium-210, emitted to atmosphere, and they tend to be captured with the flue gases, filtration and abatement equipment. And those sludges and filter cakes can contain very high levels of NORM. So that's a particular issue for the iron and gas industry. As a result of the tightening of the exemption levels and the introduction of exemption levels for particularly lead-210, that caused some real problems. As a result of that, a lot of that sludges and filter cakes are actually fed back through the plant. Some is actually sold on to be used in the cement industry, which is an additive that's used because of its high iron content. But it presents, the residue presents a problem for the industry. China clay extraction, not really been the focus of much regulatory attention, but it is actually Britain's most important mineral export after hydrocarbons, and produces quite a significant quantities of materials containing NORM, including scales similar to the oil and gas industry, which have to be descaled. There's also a significant area of land which has been affected by the deposit of wastes from the extraction of China clay. And another one which I should mention, which is was historically important, the production of phosphates, which is used in things like fertilizers and detergents and so on, from phosphoric acid, that or phosphoric acid is used to dissolve the rock. That produces a lot of wastes called phosphogypsum, which is either pumped into storage or in some cases disposed of as a slurry, or was. There were 5 plants in the UK, all of which closed in the 1980s, one of which particularly on the Cumbrian coast was authorised to discharge very significant quantities, and we're talking tons of uranium into the Irish Sea over many years. That resulted in significantly enhanced levels of natural radionuclides in shellfish. And in fact, after Sellafield cleaned up its act and reduced its radioactive discharges, this was for a time the largest source of radioactive discharges into the Irish Sea. So in terms of norm wastes, there are significant quantities of norm waste produced, far larger quantities produced even today than are produced by the nuclear industry. So we have large quantities of norm waste produced, virtually all of which is still disposed of with conventional wastes, predominantly to landfills, and the vast majority of that as exempt wastes. The problems with that are when Radioactive Substances Act 1960 was introduced, it really enshrined the waste management practices of the day, which the dump was literally a dump. It had, if it had a fence around it, you were lucky. There were the people operating it was just a guy with a flat cap and a whippet who'd be employed to come along and open the gate at the beginning of the day and shut it after the last lorry had left. So there was no real expertise, no technical knowledge within the waste management industry of the day, and so the requirement for authorizations, when they issued authorizations for non-exempt disposals, that was issued to the waste producer, who was best placed to understand the risks associated with the wastes, not the landfill operator. And that was the case right up until 2007. And the issue with exempt waste disposal, which is the vast majority of norm, is that there has never been any requirement to register its use. So any marking that it's radioactive has to be removed. The landfill operator does not even have to be told that they are disposing of exempt wastes. So what that means is it's virtually impossible to obtain accurate data on norm waste production and disposal routes, both historically and today, because so much has been disposed of under exemption. And also, when you're looking at a particular site and you're looking at its history, it's virtually impossible to determine whether norm waste has been deposited there, because there are no records of exempt disposals. The records of authorised disposals, if they were kept, will be associated with the waste producer, not the disposal site itself. And in fact, there was no requirement for authorization of any waste disposal before 1974, and no requirement to keep any records at all until 1994. So there are over 30,000 closed landfills in the UK, the majority of which were closed before the waste management licensing regulations came into force in 1994. Prior to that, anybody that held a waste management license or control of pollution license, as it was then, could simply surrender their license at any time with no requirement, no obligation for aftercare of the site. So many were surrendered prior to the waste management licensing regs coming into force, and they just became orphan sites. Nobody is responsible for their management and upkeep. So many of those sites, many of those landfills are likely to have received exempt radioactive wastes, including norm. A significant proportion actually have received some quite significant quantities of both norm and nuclear radioactive wastes. And of course, as these sites are redeveloped, as they erode, they can expose those wastes and cause problems. So in terms of norm contaminated land, there was a study in 2005, which concluded that there might be somewhere between 100 and 1,000 radioactive contaminated sites in England and Wales with the potential to give rise to doses in the millisievert range. The most likely estimate was 150 to 250. Virtually all of those were due to either radium luminizing activities or the disposal of wastes from that, or closed landfills. But this potential for the existence of radioactive contamination is frequently overlooked, largely because of the lack of awareness. So we're not just talking about landfills, we're often talking about on-site disposals. So there's a list there, for example, of 15 MOD sites, which the MOD has quite reluctantly and quite recently admitted have some radium contamination, mainly as a result of burning or disposal of old luminized equipment. That's almost certainly the tip of the iceberg. So I'm conscious that time is running out. This is nearly the end of the presentation. But in terms of regulation, in terms of contaminated land regulation, the UK introduced what's called the Part 2A regulatory regime for contaminated land in 2000, which was effectively an intervention regime to identify and enforce the regulation of sites which were presenting unacceptable risks from contamination. Ideally, forcing the persons responsible for that contamination, the polluters, to actually undertake the remediation. That regime was extended in 2006 to include radioactivity. But there are some important differences from the treatment of non-radioactive contamination under that regime. It only applies to land where the radioactivity is present as a result of an authorized activity or an emergency. It doesn't apply to current practices or to natural background radiation. It doesn't apply on civil or defense nuclear sites. And importantly, in terms of determining whether there is an unacceptable risk, it only considers the risk to human health. It doesn't consider risks to the environment. And it also sets the bar extremely high. Harm is only defined as a dose of, to the public, an effective dose of more than 3 millisieverts a year. If you compare that with a dose limit of public exposure under the ionizing radiation, so that's where you're deliberately using radioactivity in a practice, of 1 millisievert a year, that's a very high bar to set. The result is that to date, there have been no sites formally designated as radioactive contaminated land under the regulations. The only site to have come close is Dalgety Bay in Fife, which was a former MOD airfield where the disposal of radium luminized artifacts took place, and those disposal areas have subsequently been eroded and also through the acts of a developer. And this is politically, has always been politically very sensitive. It's the constituency of the former Prime Minister Gordon Brown. It had a very high public profile, and it's been the result of a protracted dispute between the Scottish Government and the MOD over liability. You can see the statistics there. To date, over 3,000 radioactive artifacts removed, some very significantly radioactive. And the MOD, as far as I know, the current status is the MOD is monitoring it to determine the extent of radioactivity and to determine what needs to be done by way of remediation. So finally, in terms of remediation, the all the sites that have been cleaned up, radioactive contaminated sites that have been cleaned up, have been regulated under other regimes, either for radioactive substances or ionizing radiation regulations. But generally, it's the perception of the risk rather than science that drives the choice of remedial solution. So there's been a strong preference for what you might call dig and dump remediation, where you remove the entire source and take it away and dump it somewhere else to remove the blight, because the majority of those sites have been redeveloped as a result of redevelopment projects. So that's really the end of my quick run through of norm contamination issues. So I'll hand back to Peter. Any questions?
Thank you, Trevor. That was extremely interesting.